Thanks
Welcome,
everyone
Rich.
for your time. So today I want to talk about strategic tools and tactics for IT in the AI native workplace. And one of the reasons I think this is such an important topic is many of us are coming from a traditional IT experience and we're trying to figure out how to navigate the journey towards this sort of new AI native experience. And this isn't just true for IT, this is true for every employee, but because many of us are in the tech space, we're about enablement, we're about support. I wanted to kind of talk about some of the key considerations there. Now, this is definitely an evolving thing. So one of the big takeaways from all of this is I would love to connect with many of you. So if you have a chance to reach out to me on LinkedIn, we can have a meeting, one to few discussion with maybe some of your peers. But a lot of the insights that I'm going to share today are going to be generalized instead of being prescriptive. And one of the big challenges with community events like this is, people don't always feel comfortable reaching out to people. So again, I'm super friendly. I really would love to continue the discussion and provide more prescriptive guidance or details. And it's a great way for me to learn. So with that, let me dive right into the core discussion today. Most organizations are going through a pretty significant period of change. And as employees, partners, and customers expect more and ask for more, we are addressing that need from an IT perspective. Yet we're overwhelmed ourselves, and so are our teams and our organizations. And so there's this proposal that maybe AI can help bridge this gap, or in some ways, maybe it'll make the gap even more significant. And one of the big differences is how you approach IT in the AI era. When you think of an AI native workplace, we have to think of AI native IT and how that's fundamentally different than previous forms of IT. And that's really what I want to talk about today. Now, this is not a comprehensive list. That's way too detailed, but let me just explain a few key concepts. One of the biggest ones is that we are going through a transition and we are learning as we go. And so there are a number of different things that change from an IT leadership perspective. Rather than talk through a bunch of charts, I'm going to try my best throughout today to show different specific examples of slight adjustments in how you approach things that will get you closer towards that AI native IT experience. And, again, this is a continual discussion. So the way I've broken this down is there are three categories of AI and how it changes IT. The first is how it changes our approach from a velocity perspective. So think of how, things are getting faster. We're shifting from months, cycles, much faster delivery cycles from an IT perspective. And of course, that also means the ecosystem is shifting. Think of like the feature, speed of features that are released. Think of the speed of security threats. Think of the speed of compliance changes and much more. So velocity isn't just affecting our employees, but it's affecting IT leadership as well. In addition to this, we also need to tackle variety, and that's a really important concept as well. There's more and more experiences, more tools, more ways in which people are working, even the kind of content people are producing now, where people are now creating, whether it's vibe coding or some other term, people are creating apps and experiences that aren't just documents anymore, right? So there's a lot of changes happening there, or even more recently, video changes where videos are becoming like documents in many instances, and we're seeing how that's changing the collaboration cycle. Again, not enough time to talk about it, but imagine an organization that's a remote first organization or an AI first organization. You're going to do a lot more, video recordings of saying, hey, this is this and that, let me explain this concept, and a lot less of those interactive meetings. Because again, the beauty of the video is people can jump around, they can use AI to analyze it, they can respond to elements of the video, and these lead to greater collaborative success scenarios. So we'll talk about collaboration and a number of other things within that AI changing variety space. And then lastly, we're going to wrap up with AI changing volume. And volume is a really big challenge. The scale and the between the velocity and the variety, this new volume and scaling challenge is a big one for IT to address, and IT is well situated to potentially deliver a lot of value there. All right, so let's dig into velocity. Now, this is a pretty easy one to cover. I think everyone on a call like this, or if you're attending something like an AI native workplace conference, this wonderful community event, you're probably already aware that AI is an exponential technology. It's fundamentally different than some technologies, ones that are linear, and it's one that is going to have significant impacts in the way it transforms the way we work, IT, and our businesses. But this isn't unique. We have gone through exponential technologies before. The difference is the pace of this one and potentially the scope of it. So in previous cycles, we had the internet, I think is a great example, but it took many years before we had routers and modems and Wi-Fi. We had things that slowed things down in terms of delivery so that it wasn't available everywhere. And so the transformation was slower in terms of its total pace. And we saw, this continual shrink, and now we're seeing AI really measured in years. I think if we're lucky, for many of us, it feels like it's being measured in quarters. And so that's really fundamentally different from a shift perspective. One way to visualize this is to show that an exponential technology curve kind of looks like this, right? It's very different than linear. And linears, by the way, can be step progressions. So if you were, before the pandemic, you had a poor hybrid work experience, you had this big step up to mature that so that you could be closer, from a parallel perspective, closer to the similar experience remotely as before. So that might have been a big step for some orgs. For some orgs, it would be a smaller step. But in both instances, it's linear because once you kind of plateau there, once you have a parity of an experience layer, you often don't need a lot more. There's improvements, of course, but it's not a substantial shift. Exponential technologies are fundamentally different because what they are is they're continually evolving and they're near limitless in the ways that they can be applied and used. And so that means that these particular transformative events like AI native workplace transformations, they need to be led by the business, not by technologists alone. And that's really, really important. All right. Let's talk about what this little curve means and that great example with the pandemic with remote work. Well, we know that if you wait longer, it's more steep of a curve and it's more expensive and more challenging. While that may not be as bad for linear scenarios, it is substantially bad for exponential ones because there's a loss of opportunity, there's a loss of many things that happens. So leaders, especially IT leaders, need to proactively bridge this gap, right? And scale AI faster within organizations. And that's really the goal of a lot of what AI native workplace transformation is. And delaying investments just leads to a steeper climb, right? So again, this is not really an option for us. Especially this delay could be measured in months, not even in years. And that's really important. The cycle time is much shorter. All right, so how might we address this? How do we bridge this gap? Well, there's lots of things we could talk about here. Obviously, the starting points would be digital assistant deployment, augmenting our workforces with AI, and using AI in an add-on capacity. That's what we call AI-powered organizations, which are different than AI-native ones. But it's still a really good first starting point because, again, most organizations aren't just going to flip on their head and be able to make that transition easily. These things make it a lot easier to start shifting more to AI native in specific pockets or elements of the organization, again, if you're not starting from scratch. So what this means is that, we need to look at AI agents and automation. We need to look at different tools that will help us with that. Scaled security, governance, management, employee experience and how the employee experience works is really critical because, every employee is going through an AI powered journey towards, for many, an AI native employee experience journey. And so those are very fundamental shifts and it takes time and not everyone's ready to make that shift. And we don't want to necessarily rotate all of our staff, right? We want to keep people and make them as performant as possible, while some who are ready to be AI native can lead that charge and that transformation that we want. So that's a really important thing to look at. Now, I've picked one particular area of this to dive into just to give some examples. And I think that this is a good one because we often underestimate its importance. So migration, modernization, and connection, or just in general consolidation, is on the rise. Now, we had this wonderful State of Microsoft 365 report based on recent research with ShareGate as an example is 100,000 plus IT pros in the Microsoft 365 space that use that product and platform, and they trust it and they use it quite heavily. And in that work with those customers and those people, we see interesting data insights. So one of the things you might expect is that you might actually see a decrease over year of legacy or on-prem environments to the cloud. Why? Because as more and more move to the cloud, there should be less total population or volume. However, what we've seen is a very sharp increase in the last while in people going to, from file shares, from SharePoint servers, from things like that to Microsoft 365. Now, a big part of that is AI, the promise of AI. There's so much value in AI, but it's really limited based on the data you feed it, based on the context and the information that we can provide with it. That is our IP, that is our value, legacy-wise, and we need to get that ingested in AI or accessible AI. Sometimes we connect it, but a lot of times consolidation ends up being the goal for most organizations. And so that's why you see that sharp increase. Similarly, you might expect, oh, okay, well, that makes sense, but what about the cloud environments? Well, we actually see a lot of consolidation happening away from Google because, again, a lot of organizations are saying, hey, I want to use Microsoft 365. I want to use Copilot. This is our core part of our strategy. And so we're seeing a lot of consolidation there. And we're seeing, of course, consolidation of tenants. So if you have multiple tenants, you're seeing that consolidate down. Before, maybe you could get away with it. Now with AI, especially the way AI works across tenants, it's fundamental that you get less of those barriers and friction points. And this is important as well for mergers and acquisitions. As you can imagine, lots of people are accelerating the work in migration consolidation because they want to unlock AI faster. So these are all things that create more pressure on consolidation in a good way for us to get rid of some of that debt, some of those challenges, and more. Now, why is this also really important from an IT perspective? Not only does this empower the value realization we want from AI at a better, more efficient perspective, but it also allows us to do this in a more scalable and secure way. So one of the big things that a lot of people love about data posture is things like Purview, where we can look at how AI is being used across our data estate. And if your data isn't in Microsoft 365 connected or discoverable by Microsoft 365, this becomes really challenging because it's not being identified. And this isn't about labeling. This isn't about Purview and implementing Purview. This is just about the second you get that content into the cloud, you can start to see things like what kind of data is it? And, is that content, especially with Defender and other types of endpoints, can we see how it's transitioning into other environments? And these things combined leads to an experience where shadow AI can be directly addressed in two fundamental ways. One, hey, there's less people taking that data from that file share or whatever it is, that legacy environment, or from Google or whatever, and sharing it into those services where you don't see, so that's like shadow because we don't have that visibility. And two, we make it easier because then people go, well, if it's already in Copilot, it's already in Microsoft 365, moving it somewhere else is extra work. Maybe that friction isn't worth it, and that leads to a reduction in shadow AI as well. So this is all important because it adds more value. Copilot is much better the more content's shared and the more content is modernized within it. And that makes a lot of sense. But this is especially true for AI native workplaces because what it is it's not just about getting the content into Microsoft 365, but then it's about how do we look at that ecosystem of content and how do we enrich it and improve it. And this is where a lot of restructuring doesn't just happen in the lift and shift to Microsoft 365, as I mentioned, from legacy or in consolidation, but it actually happens within the environment. And again, ShareGate, big fan of the tool. Obviously, I get to work there. Is something that can help with both of those. All right. Let's talk about the elephant in the room then. If IT is responsible for AI's success, what is the things that IT is uniquely responsible for that the rest of the business leadership is not? And I think a lot of that leads to the same discussion. What is the big challenges in something like that consolidation effort that I just mentioned? Well, it turns out security and compliance is the top challenge. And that's not just true for M&As, where obviously there's a really big emphasis on that, but that's true for even these legacy transitions. So what we need to do is we need to think about how that works. In a simple way to frame this, if you've seen the newer agent experiences, like the knowledge agent from Microsoft Copilot, or a number of other experiences like that, we know that it's really important to structure your information and improve how it's structured. So this means when you go from, let's say legacy SharePoint server to SharePoint Online, you're going to do things like you're going to flatten site collection structures. You're going to do things like merge groups and teams and things like that. And why do we do that? Because wherever we can, that makes it easier from a permission management perspective for us to facilitate this. That doesn't mean we need to lose anything. It's really important that all those security efforts and legacy that we've done, that we preserve that. But then there becomes this opportunity to automate and optimize that permissioning estate. And that becomes really critical at the scale, which we'll come back to later. Again, this is about velocity. So how do you do that fast? And again, this is where I love ShareGate. So there's different tools and techniques, but one of the great ones is you do permission matrix assessments. You do things like bulk editing of permissions, maybe during the move, maybe after the move for migration, or even little things like being able to clone user permissions or things like that. You have a new employee that joins, how might you automate some of those activities? All of this becomes really, really important important as, people don't just onboard, but they have to onboard into an agent ecosystem, which has expectations of access to key data sets within the organization. So all this to say, we know security and compliance is better in Microsoft 365, but why does it sometimes get delayed? Why is it that some organizations don't do this consolidation as fast as others? Because remember, the goal here is to move, up that blue line faster, so that we're, at the state that we need to be by the end of the year, to be closer to AI native, or maybe even exploring AI native properly. And to do that, what we need to do is we have to recognize that theoretical gaps are not really worth the time. One of the big challenges right now is that you'll get people, and there's this, there's a great insight from the report where the same people, so, you have all these IT pros, Microsoft 365 IT pros and admins that filled out the surveys, and they're basically saying like, hey, we have a reason to stay on-prem, and that's data security and data control. And we have, the number one reason to move online is also security. And so the same people will answer both those questions. And so the question becomes, why is it slowing down? Like, why aren't we doing this consolidation faster? And a big reason for that is because people say, well, we need to get it set up properly, deployed, implemented, everything in online, and then we can make that transition, we'll feel more confident in it. And again, the great example from earlier, I'll just cite it again, something like data posture and security management scenarios. Those are things that you get the second you're online. So even if you're not using labels, even if you're not applying DLP, you're not having E5s for everyone, the fact that you have the ability to understand your data estate better the second you bring it online is already better than what you have today. The fact is, there's a lot of other scenarios like this that are just enabled in the online environment that we just didn't have in the legacy. So this is important for the business to understand and for IT to lead here and really say this is why we need to go much faster. All right. So that's migration, modernization, consolidation. Those things are really important, but that's just one of these many measures that are changing with velocity. All right. So how do we take this from a higher level? We need to know that it's important to move faster. And that's really what we're talking about. Shifting away from doing this in years to months, that's really critical as we look at the state of AI today and the state of organizational readiness. So AI is changing velocity. IT can lead that change, but they need to think about how to bridge that gap, and they need to think about what are the levers they're responsible for uniquely that allow them to bridge that gap faster. And that lets them focus more on transformation and the things they should be versus, support and reactive firefighting. All right. So the second big challenge for IT is how it changes variety. Now, this is an incredibly complex topic, and so I'm going to simplify it to a few key ideas. The first one is that employees are transforming how they work today. And that makes sense because we're seeing people shift away from a vast mix of tools, think of all these different tools used for collaboration, towards more and more a single, more unified set that is AI first. And you see this especially with more mature organizations. They call them frontier organizations from a Microsoft perspective, but organizations that have already adopted AI, they've already deployed Copilot at scale. And we see that even something as simple as collaboration, which has multiple forms, shifts more and more towards Copilot-centric or AI native style focuses and experiences. And that becomes important because it means it doesn't really matter if some cohort uses a bunch of these different tools, as long as AI becomes the connector, interweaving between them, that becomes the unified set of experiences. And the collective versus individual focus becomes really, really important here. All right, so one way to tackle variety is to focus on collective versus individual. And another one is to think about things like communication, collaboration, and operations, and how each of those three categories are fundamentally changing in the AI era. You could describe operations also as management if you want to get into that as well. All right, what's another key element of this variety? Well, we have a new type of experience that we haven't really had before. From an IT perspective, we're used to doing things like process automation. In fact, using AI for process automation is something that almost every IT organization is pretty good at measuring, understanding, and applying. Where they struggle is the in-between. So what about those exceptions in the business? How do we tackle those? And this is where AI as a digital assistant or, the core principled idea of these generative AI tools is really hard for IT to wrap its head around, because these are unique situations. They're very business proactive centric, where you need to work directly with the business. They're much more process centric. When I say process, I'm also talking about lowercase p processes. So again, IT, we understand capital P processes, like how does the order come in so that it goes eventually onto the truck and then gets shipped. We know those capital P processes. That's SAP, that's an ERP system, that's this. There's all these different tools here, and we know what those tools are, and we know those processes. And IT is, again, very used to doing that optimization. Where they struggle is the lowercase p processes, the people processes, or the processes in the organization that orient more around things like people, these lowercase p processes. And that's exactly where AI is having the biggest transformative impact today. It's around the stuff that's not well documented, the stuff that is team centric. It's like a layer lower in the organization, not department even centric, but like how a team performs and does their work together. That becomes the layer that we really need to engage with as IT, so that we can help them amplify not just digital agent success, augmentation of AI, but actually towards AI native or transformative change with agents. And that becomes the really key element there. So what I'm saying is this is a challenge, but there is an answer to it. And I think one of the ways to visualize this is to think of it like these gears. But essentially what we want to do as IT is we want to invest, maybe double down or even triple down investment in digital assistants and lightweight agents. Think of those quick retrieval agents, the lower complexity agents that teams can use to get immediate benefit. And then as they use those agents, they get more visibility. We'll talk about that in a second. And as they get more visibility, they can improve. And that leads to a much easier transition towards broader process transformation, because that's where we need to get to for an AI native versus just process optimization. But again, what we're seeing is this investment here is driving this investment. This investment together is making it much easier to turn this thing at a much faster pace. Hopefully that visual cue makes sense. But again, IT is trying to push this wheel on its own, or this gear on its own, with the business is also really interested in this and often underestimates the importance of these two gears and why they need to be focused on. So let's talk more about these two gears. I have a really simple visual way of doing this. Hopefully this resonates with you. Many of us have retros. We have a Friday meeting or something, and before that Friday meeting, we get together and we talk about, what worked, what didn't, those types of things. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how the experience for an employee or the experience around AI matures through different phases or categories here. So let's talk through the first one. We just prompt. We say, hey, AI, you're my simple on-demand assistant or thought partner, and I want you to draft a team report. What happened this week across meetings, emails, and document updates? Get that nice summary so I'm ready for today's retro. Maybe I do this on Friday morning. So that's an example of a starting prompt, again, the base level. Then what ends up happening is we dive a bit deeper and we start to say things like, okay, well, what I want to do is I want to schedule that. I want it actually to happen on Thursday, so I'm going to schedule that prompt. And then I want to make sure that not only do I do that, but I also want to get input from the team. So I'm going to schedule a few things. I'm going to schedule that prompt, and maybe I'm going to schedule some, Power Automate or some lightweight automation where I'm going to reach out to people, get their feedback, and then have AI reason over that feedback, whatever people provide, and then put that together into that more comprehensive report. So we're doing multiple prompts, and we're using lightweight automation like scheduling. I'm calling this actioning. We're doing things like that, proactive actions that will help us. And that's like a different level for organizations and teams to use. Then you get into agents. Now, agents are a little bit more complex, because what we do is we might do some of those things I just mentioned using lightweight agents, but really what we want here is something that, those little prompts aren't really successful for. We need it to do multiple turns, multiple activities on its own or actions on its own, with less of our oversight until it hits certain milestones. So here's an example. I might have a prompt that looks for differences in perspectives, specifically on a daily basis, based on the meetings and the emails and the chat conversations. And I want these differences of perspective because we know that in those retro meetings, it's really important to understand what are the, not maybe disagreements, but where are there friction points? Where are there differences of perspective that maybe are relevant for us to optimize within those retros? So there, I'm going to do the same thing I was doing before. I'm going to do the schedule prompts. I'm going to do things like that. But now I want the agent to provide recommendations based on best practices. That means going and retrieving stuff from the web, going and retrieving stuff from maybe our centers of excellence internally, share and gather that team impact and input, and then put those into that daily, weekly report. So this idea is we've shifted now to a multiple step process using something like a research agent that's doing these activities, and it's combining a set of agent experiences with prompts. And that's where we're chaining things to get a better result, right? This is where we start to get into true digital collaboration, and we're getting closer to an AI native scenario. And it's important to understand that it's easy to underestimate this particular phase of transformation. But again, most organizations get a tremendous amount of value from basic retrieval agents. Think of that researcher agent. Think of scenarios where I just need to get answers to key questions and coordinate and correlate things. Those are all retrieval scenarios. And the more narrow they are, the more it's closer to the way the team works, what the team cares about, like our example with the retro, the better value it often provides. And then what we're doing in this scenario is we've empowered them to do this through the digital assistant and some educational stuff. But now what we're getting into is them modernizing. They're starting to think through that process and flow and saying, well, if I'm going to do it this way, how might I be able to do some of these manual steps a little bit faster? Not only things that we're doing today, but things that we're not even doing today. We've never really looked at differences of perspective before that Friday meeting. And it's an important area of management excellence and other categories. So now what we're going to do is we're going to do that extra, something totally new we didn't do before, and an agent or AI is going to do that for us. That's that modernizing experience where we're doing something new and transforming how we work over time. And that leads us towards autonomous agents, which we'll talk about maybe at the end when we start to talk about how this all works together. All right, so how does this change from agent orchestration to agents orchestrating agents? Well, at this stage, what we're really seeing is this idea of looking at signals proactively and spinning up specialist agents to do different activities. A great example of this is now that we have this great rhythm, and this might have happened over weeks again. This is not months. This isn't even years. So now we have a better retro, but we're starting to realize, the whole idea of the retro doesn't make a lot of sense if we don't need to have it on a Friday. What if we could do the retro more interactively, more predictively throughout the week? When are those opportunities where a little, one-to-one discussion or a little signal could make a big difference so that you're not waiting 2 or 3 days before something gets resolved on the retro? How do we make sure that the retro itself doesn't feel like there's 2 people talking at times instead of the whole of the team in terms of value? Well, again, these are things that we can do. So what was the original outcome? What was the point of the retro? How do we take that and rethink the process? And this is that process transformation or redesign. And this is where agents orchestrating agents can do things that we could never do before. They could look for those signals, like those differences of perspective, like risks and other things like that. They could create automatically suggestions for meetings, maybe schedule some connects between people or escalate to different people, maybe a manager or a team lead to say, hey, this is an FYI. And then they can proactively use those same agents to then, coordinate some interaction. And then by the time the Friday meeting comes around, it's more about shared understanding, helping people catch up instead of the traditional retro that we've done before, because the traditional retro is now being done interwoven throughout the week and in a much better way. Hopefully this makes sense, but that's the kind of transformation we're talking about as we move towards AI native. And this makes a lot more sense when you take a step back and you think about the overall journey that we have with AI. For many organizations today, what they think about is, how do we, as IT, how do we automate those key parts of the process? You think of API calls, think of the way you might interact with data, think of those more traditional methods. I don't want to say legacy, just traditional ways of automation. And while this API layer is still true, there's lots actually AI can do at this layer. The truth is AI does stuff everywhere. And that's the big difference from before. And this is why AI native is so promising versus AI powered, because you can improve how people work in the current flow, and you can add AI to augment that flow in a number of ways. And again, I think everyone should start there. But then comes the question of what if this whole process, right, which is what we really want, which is like this, completed training or whatever, what if we take a step back and we go, well, what is this really the outcome we're trying to drive, and how might we do this totally different from agents and AI in the first place? And that's closer to the way AI native works versus AI powered or AI augmented, if you prefer those terms, that we use today. But this is a big shift, right? Again, not just focusing on things like this API layer, an actor or system actor, but actually saying like, no, even all these roles have augmentation first. And then as we augment this, we get visibility. And that visibility allows us, like a flywheel, to then figure out ways that we could transform that process. All right. You have to start with augmentation because that gives you the visibility in the first place. All right. Why is this so true? Because agents, everyone says agents, right? I've probably said it a million times already. Maybe if anyone is counting, I'd love to see at the end of the conference how many times maybe we can use AI to look at all the workshops and the sessions. But what you're going to see is that agents are still absolutely the emphasis for 2026. But why are agents everywhere? Why is agents like the number one focus for business investment, for IT? It's because instead of apps, agents, right? Agents have telemetry by design. They tell you how people are using it, literally in the way in which people use it. Think of like every interaction you have with an agent, it can understand what you're saying, why you're saying it. There's lots of ways to do this safely, by the way. I'm not saying you should explore every single prompt, although you could do that and then, analyze those to figure out like which ones are failing, where are people dissatisfied, where does it end? The multi-turn stops here, and then it feels like maybe the person didn't get the result that they wanted, and so on and so forth. This is all an emerging space because we have richer data than we've ever had before, and this is getting better. But this is a different promise than we've ever had before. What it means is that the people processes in an organization can be visible. And if they can be visible, AI and great smart people can transform and improve those. And IT has historically always been project-based, where you have an intake process. IT in an AI native workplace can't be that way. It has to be proactive. And at this level, where we're looking at like, hey, as you've been using it, we've seen opportunities for automation because why? IT is a technologist. IT knows how to use the digital tools in a way that even an AI native employee will not, because they can look at the ecosystem. They can look at what's coming. They can look at new capabilities and how those could be used in different ways at a scale that the employee can't. And because of those things, IT still has value in a AI native organization, but it's a very different kind of value than the way we've been working. So again, this is very, very important to really wrap your head around because it is not the same. Now, again, vibe coding, right now is all about apps, and everyone's building all these really cool apps, and that is definitely on the rise, right? You're going to see lots of people building like, fit for purpose, specific types of apps for scenarios. But even those apps will shift very rapidly towards agents because the agent will provide more value to that business lead who's doing that transformation than the app will. And so this will just make natural sense as we see 2026, 2027 as the years progress. All right. I want to talk about benchmarking, and keep the questions, by the way, in the chat on the sidebar coming. If anyone has questions about some of the things I've shared, I'd be happy to slow down and do some interactive back and forth. But one of the big things with benchmarking is, it's misleading. So one of the things you'll see is all these benchmarks being broken. Oh man, it passed the bar is the oldest one, right? That we always reference. And then there's like the newer ones like, it's PhD level math, etc. And while these are true, it's really important to understand that the AI doesn't necessarily equate the same way within work. In the working world, it's not quite the same as some of these frontier scenarios. Now, these are all important to understand, but what I mean by that is that there are things that it still struggles with, like information retrieval and fact recall is still an area that is quite weak comparatively to other areas within AI today. And so this becomes important, again, going back to why are we doing the consolidation? Why do we spend energy on optimizing our data? And we'll talk about governance in a little bit as we talk about volume. It's because of these things. So many, many leaders that I talk to in organizations, even IT leaders, don't understand enough about what AI's current state and capabilities are compared to what they're hearing it can do. And so it's really important for us to have ways in which we can test this. I'll come back to this in a second. I want math. So I want to talk about math. It's kind of like an inverse to what we're seeing with all the benchmarks, right? In sort of saturation, there's this concept of reliability, and there's a problem with reliability. And there are different types of benchmarks that test for reliability, but this is really important for a business scenario. So I know it's math, but let me just explain the concept. What you see is a lot of these scientific reports that talk about benchmarking, they use this pass at. And this is really important to look at when you're reading these reports. Pass at 1, pass at 5, pass at whatever. What that means is it will succeed at least once within X attempts. And so that can give it a very misleading, benchmark number because it can pass those, even if it's guessing, even if it's doing a bunch of things, like it can do that. So then what happens is, what about reliability? Well, we know that there are scenarios, like let's take airline booking or something like that, where you have huge transactional volume. You have a lot of these processes happening much more rapidly, and the value or the impact of getting it wrong is quite substantial, right? Think of the cost for rebooking and rescheduling and all these other things. So what you have to look at is you have to look at the cost of the mistake, and you have to look at the accuracy. And then when you start to look at it in this way, this is the pass to the power of, what we're looking at is consecutive requests, and then that really is a better measure for these things. So, do benchmarks need improvements? Absolutely. We'll see this continue from a external perspective. But in the enterprise, what we're really caring about is consecutive, reliable requests, not just the one-off, like, could it do it? Absolutely. But that's the jagged edge of AI. For every one time it does it, there's 3 or 4 times that maybe you're struggling with it. For every 70 minutes, for every 7 minutes of productivity gain, sometimes you feel like you're arguing with AI for 70 minutes. And so, this verification, this validity, these things add cost, and those costs can often mean that a scenario that you want to use AI for, and it could do it, is not reliable enough, or the verification, the toll it takes is too high. And so what that means is we need to delay that till later. It means in 3 months, 6 months, or even a year, it absolutely might be mathematical sense to do, but right now it may not. And this has been true for a long time with all machine learning. I'm referencing an old a blog post specifically because it's old. This is not new for many in this space, but for IT and the broader ecosystem, I think this is new. So what are we really looking for? AI ROI or agent ROI or any of this stuff? We're really talking about accuracy and the cost of the mistakes. And what you do is you come up with a scenario, you run it through AI, you check these things, and then what you do is at some point in time you rerun it, and eventually the cost modeling is really positive, like it's highly really accurate, or the cost of mistakes go down because you can use AI to resolve some of these mistakes. And when that happens, boom, let's do the switch over. And again, this leads towards AI native transformation, because what we're doing right now is we're augmenting the way we work with AI, which is easier to measure accuracy and cost of mistakes because we have legacy, we have baselines, right? We have historics. And when you use the true AI native stuff, what we're doing is we're taking this a step further. So again, you need to start here, really understand this. And then once you've gotten really good at this, then it becomes easier because now we have a new, interesting, very different style of baseline with AI native. And then that baseline has, again, these types of measures. But hopefully by then you've codified it, you've come up with techniques, tools, other things that help you with this type of continual measurement. Because it's very different than the way we've historically worked. Like the project model where you measure the impact after doesn't work in the AI era for these AI native orgs. All right, so that was a small sampling of how AI changes variety. Now, let's dig into a few other ones around volume. And thank you, by the way, for those who are posting on the side. I love that. I'm going to come back to those extra comments. And I totally agree. There's new papers and research all the time. And I feel like it's exciting because there's even ones studies now that are more workplace centric. So we have, there's a Harvard cybernetic teammate one, or MIT, whoever it was. That's one of my favorite ones to constantly quote. But there's new styles of studies and data. Not as many as the consumer stuff, but it's stuff that's really important nonetheless. All right, so let's talk about AI changing volume. Now, the first thing I want to highlight is how an IT role transforms. So let's just talk about what I hope is table stakes. If this is new to you, I apologize. I know this whole thing is quite fast. Definitely take a look at the recording and reach out to me after. But agent work and working with AI is more about portfolio management and ecosystem management than it is about app management, okay? But we're used to app apps. So let's use a similar analogy. And I think this is a great example because Microsoft has shipped almost everything I'm going to talk about here. So what could you do with Microsoft today? You could do things like curate agents. What are the ones that are first party? What are the third party ones? What are the ones built in the organization? You can apply and set guardrails. Okay, I want to make sure that this agent is visible and available for a certain number of people, but it's not shareable outside of those groups of people. We can look at things like how effective is the agent? What are the most popular agents? How are they being consumed? What's the outcome ratio? Is it like escalated where it has to switch to a person? Is it abandoned? Is it successfully resolved where it seems like, everything went well and the agent was able to respond and everyone seemed happy and satisfied? All sorts of different types of metrics. And these are all evolving. But again, we have this, management influx of new data and ways we can style this. And so you might think of traditional app management. Okay, we can block agents or we can unblock them, kind of like apps. We can set up rules like, well, this agent can be deployed to these users, but it's only available up until this. Or, anyone can deploy an agent, but once you hit 2 or 3 people or more, it becomes something that IT needs to be visible and managing and co-managing. And so maybe that's a scenario. Or we need a business sponsor or a user. Think of like a person specifically that's going to lead this agent and be the person that we can ask questions to do attestations, to do review processes with, et cetera. Well, what are the agents that have no owner? And maybe that has consequences. Well, okay, if an agent has no owner, you can use it individually, but maybe you can't share it. And so these are all scenarios that, again, it makes sense. We go from a traditional app management model and we start to overlay that with agents. And that's where we are today. For most IT organizations, we're just getting used to treating these in this way. But agents and AI in general creates new types of risks that we didn't have before. And this leads to new responsibilities for IT, and this is where we start to see that shift. Again, can already be overwhelming, I understand, but this is only the beginning. What we need to do as IT is we need to lean in, complete all this, and then move towards this idea of observability and what we do based on those risks. And this proactive, I want to say compliant first, but like scalable portfolio platform style approach is really critical. Okay, so what's an example of this? So let's take a simple scenario. You have this Copilot Studio based agent that was created in the organization. It's solving a particular team's set of problems. What we could do is we could look for signal data to say things like, hey, there's unethical instances or execution activity happening around this agent. Now, this doesn't mean that it's necessarily a problem. There are data points for that agent that it can use and consume, but there's a risk here that needs to be evaluated and understood. And this is new because this is something that we must do right away, right from the very, very beginning with agents, because agents are fundamentally different than other experiences that we've been familiar with. AI itself is fundamentally different. So let's take an example here with the Contoso invoice agent. And what we can do with the Contoso invoice agent is we pop it open. We can see, oh, here's the knowledge source that it's referring to. And inside that knowledge source, we can see things like, well, there's a number of unlabeled content sources that are being presented in it. Maybe we should have a default label. You can see that recommendation right here. That's really important. But outside of that default recommendation label, maybe we also want to restrict access for other labels. We have content that is labeled. Maybe we want to make sure that AI cannot use that content. Maybe it's like merger content. Maybe it's other types of things. Maybe it's a certain type of invoice. Think of an invoice that's extremely confidential and highly sensitive. Maybe we want, for now, to avoid AI processing or working with that particular type of invoice because the cost of a mistake is much higher with those invoices versus the vast majority of other invoices. Does that make sense? It goes back to the thing we talked about earlier. So what does IT do? Well, again, we can create a policy for that. I didn't go through all the click-throughs here, but you can create a policy in Purview. And then that policy can now be applied. So we have a default label and we have a sensitive policy. And then we can see that there's some other interesting things. In this data source, we can see there's a lot of unused files or older files and content. And that's problematic because, again, what if it's referring, now invoices might be fine, but what if it's creating, when we think of reg scenarios and other scenarios, what if it's creating reliability issues? Again, Copilot and the way it works within an enterprise, everything should be grounded. Grounding is the way you do verification. And so if it's not grounded on a particular data asset, that That's how we avoid a lot of hallucination risks. That's how we become more reliable. That becomes important. But what if your content is out of date? And so this goes back to the very first thing I mentioned with velocity. We need to understand how to consolidate, and then we need to understand how to optimize our content, how to optimize our estate. So while you can do protection scenarios like this at scale, to do these types of resolutions, I think it requires a slightly different approach. And this is where I want to, again, digress for a second to talk about a change in how we work. Historically, if you're IT, you could get away with service-centric sensitivity and lifecycle. So we understand how the service works, and we do things like external sharing rules for OneDrive, external sharing rules for SharePoint. And then we have container-centric. Oh, okay, external sharing rules for this site collection, for this team, for this private channel. And these could be different, right, based on all sorts of different criteria. That's container-centric sensitivity and lifecycle. But what we need, like it's this was always necessary, but it's no longer sufficient to do just container-centric modeling. Now we need document or data or row level or whatever framing you want to use, item level. We need that level sensitivity and lifecycle. That's how Copilot works. That's how we scale at a faster way within the AI native workplace. And so this means that we need to shift from here to there. And I'll tell you, most organizations still struggle with container-centric. So imagine how hard it is for IT to shift from container-centric when they're already struggling to just get, through that layer towards document-centric. And that's the real crux of the problem. It's not that Purview and all this stuff can't help you. It's that many organizations have never deployed Purview, at least to that level. And it's because they don't know how. It's not the cost. It's not E5s. It's not that type of thing. It's actually consistently that there's not a clear playbook. It's a complex thing. So how do we do it? So this is the playbook. You essentially go through these 10 steps. And if you do these 10 steps right, you're essentially solving the vast majority of these risks at scale. And then that allows you to focus on the other things I mentioned, like observability, opportunities for transformation and improvement with agents and things like that. All right, so how do we do this? Well, it turns out step 5 is the big problem. Intelligent default labels should do 99% of cases. What I mean by that is if I know I have a team and it's a related SharePoint site collection as well, and it's a type department equals HR, the type is a project site, and it has in it identified that there are employee files within it. Okay, so we have 3 different types of indicators. In that scenario, we know a lot about this. So what do we do? By default, that means that this space should have these kinds of sensitivity labels applied to the content, these kinds of retention rules, etc. That's the idea. So what you do is the default label based on knowable and understandable business context or other things like that is applied. And then because we have that applied at that default label, DLP only has to handle those exceptions when it's in transit, when someone put it in the wrong spot, when things like that happen. Right. So again, the default container idea or default labels becomes actually the way you scale. Simply that is the secret to scaling a lot of these Purview deployments and getting them done faster. So once you've deployed that, then the question is, why do people struggle with it? They struggle with it because they don't know enough about their environment. They don't have the right tools. They struggle with those types of things. In fact, we in that same wonderful research that I highly encourage you all to take a look at, and I'll put it in the sidebar as well, the State of Microsoft 365 report, we saw that the maintenance and management problems of Microsoft 365 were overwhelmingly proper security and access controls, governance policies, and data sprawl and lack of organization. And yet those same people, remember, these are the exact same people who say these are our top challenges, overwhelmingly use built-in Microsoft tools and nothing else. No PowerShell, no extra scripting, nothing like that. And that's the problem. You need to at least use manual policies, manual effort. And then again, a super surprising number, only 1% are using purpose-built third-party solutions, things that help augment those activities. Think of the example I gave earlier. Think of cloning permissions. Think of editing permissions at scale. Think of how ShareGate, in that example that I shared at the very beginning with migrations, is fundamentally more capable than the out-of-the-box experiences and saves a lot of time. Well, you need those types of solutions at scale. And that's why we're really excited about solving this problem with a lot of customers. Now, whether it's ShareGate or somebody else, you need tools that help scale how you approach these things. Because if you can't get that service one, check mark, it gets done and it's proactive and it's done right. Then, understand the gaps and resolve those, remediate those issues. Then go from a smart review perspective towards the container level, remediate and resolve all of those issues. Then you get to the content level. And you need to get there first. And what we're finding overwhelmingly is that customers who are using the native capabilities, which are maturing and getting better, still really struggle to accelerate that transition. And so I do encourage, it doesn't need to be ShareGate, but using a third-party tool or at least exploring what they do and why they do that slightly differently, or what they automate through smart remediation or something like that, or smart actioning, automation that the out of the box doesn't do, is definitely worth understanding from a gap analysis perspective. And again, this is in preview right now, so you can get early access if you'd like to see and explore this before Ignite. All right, so that's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it, and just to kind of complete this whole thought, is the reason that layer all the way down to the content is so important is because that's not really what your focus is going to be. Once you've got the content layer and we've got the container level and we've got the service level and we're doing all that well, your focus needs to be on totally new things we never had to do before, like new risks around going back to those attack vectors, like these new risks that are continually evolving around AI usage. So, here's a scenario where someone's trying to jailbreak it to try trigger an exfiltration activity. We need time and effort to be able to lead with these things proactively at scale across our whole ecosystem of agents. And that is only possible if we know we're doing these other things faster and more easily. Again, think of that blue line. We need to get there faster towards that exponential curve. And I think this is just a great example of, compliant conversational design. Security risks around conversations are just fundamentally different and even more interesting when you start to explore them versus traditional app experiences. Like, again, because there's ways in which people can work with these tools more generalized, because they are more generalized in their capability set, that we struggle to predict. Now, I've talked a lot about security, but I also don't want to underestimate insecurity. So far in the volume, I've really mainly talked about how IT tackles the volume challenge at scale from a security and compliance perspective. But actually, insecurity is something that technologists, IT needs to lead, like really lean in on and lead. And there's a number of reasons why this is true. So first, let's just talk about the reality. Today, people grossly underreport how much value they're getting from AI, because there's no real incentive to say that, oh, I'm using AI and it's helping me with all these different things within my work, right? Again, think of the augmentation scenario. There's not really a benefit to doing that. So how do we tackle this issue, and what are some like very specific things you could go take away and do differently? Because this is something that, again, I think IT can lead, and I'll give some examples, of particularly only one due to sake of time, for how we can tackle this insecurity while also solving some of the adoption and security issues. And the way we do it is through allocation of licensing. So when you think about the transformation that you're going through with AI, today, we start with who has access to, Copilot in Microsoft 365, and then who has, it's called Microsoft 365 Copilot, the more powerful capability set that's $30 per user per month. Who are those people that have it? And then once you start to have that, then you start to look for these agents, as we mentioned, because every organization wants more agents, right? Because if we have too few agents per person, we're leaving efficiencies on the table. If we have too many agents, then we're overwhelming not just IT, but we're overwhelming human decision-making, judgment, things like that are really important. So it creates more risk and other factors that need to be considered. So there's this balancing act in terms of how quickly you transform towards AI native workplaces. So how do we do that? Well, it turns out that the champion, power user, specialist ratios are really important. Instead of just talking about agent to human ratios in your organization, you should be talking about things that power a more rapid transformation there. So having more champions, these are people that really love the tool. Maybe they're not the power users, not the best at it, but that's really, really useful to be able to understand. These are real numbers from a particular customer where we have 1 to 20. And then power users 1 to 50. And then maybe like specialists, think of these people as like, the top tier, like people like probably the people on this call that could support people. That would be your center of excellence. And so we need to build these capabilities. And to do that, we often use a team-based adoption model. And this makes the ROI 3 times better from an adoption perspective and drives a lot more success. So This doesn't just solve the security issues. It doesn't just make the reporting much better because teams are much better at reporting, but it also directly accelerates agent and automation opportunities. And you do this with nominations of 3 or more people. You open the nomination up. That means anyone in the org can now say, hey, I'd like access. It makes it feel more transparent and more fair. This all leads to better reductions of insecurity. This is a great technique that you can use, and it connects with those things we've talked about. So let me wrap.
Sorry about
Yep.
that, Ricard.
Perfect.
Yeah,
I'm just wrapping now.
You are you're like me. You like to talk a lot. So
Absolutely.
I know that feeling, but we need to get ready for the next ones. Sorry, deeply sorry about that.
Totally good.
Yeah.
All right, so we can do this faster together, and that's really what I'm saying. Thanks so much, everyone, for your support and time today. Definitely give feedback on the copilot.buzz.com feedback. Let us know if this helped you, and please reach out. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Richard, there was one question in the chat from Tato, I guess. Maybe you could answer that through the chat so we can get the answer to get the next presenters ready. But this was an awesome session, of course. So, and a lot of things to consider for IT.
Yeah, I think the question around this agent scenario is you got to go back to this idea of accuracy and cost of mistake. You can measure that much easier at a team level, like a group of high velocity users that work together, right? It could be cross-functional, et cetera, like 10 people, 20 people, not a department, but like a group of people. They can answer that question. Is this, agent to agent, or is this, multiple agents things working well? If you start to scale that, it gets brittle, it gets really expensive and challenging. So you gotta start small right now, and then scale that. And once you have these groups starting to use multiple agents and they're calling each other, that's when you start to really get, the opportunity to really transform through agent to agent or multiple agent orchestration.